Hello everyone, I'm Rob from 2Bi But first, looking to get your product in front of people who will love it? Promoting on podcasts like this one is the fastest growing advertising style in the world, and Zencastr's Creator Network can help you do it. Advertising on social media has seen a sharp decrease in success due to privacy issues. Think of all those times you were discussing a topic on social media and then were retargeted to buy something related to it. Kinda creepy. Unlike social media platforms, Zencastr's podcast ads do not rely on traditional user ad tracking to succeed. They created an ad unit called PPM, Podcast Performance Marketing, that allows for podcast matching using context. So brands are matched to the ideal podcasters whose content and audience are actually relevant to a brand's campaign goals without the user privacy infringement. Zencastr's mission is to make podcast advertisements as easy and accessible to business owners as Google and Facebook, but even more effective because podcast ads are 4.4 times more effective than display ads for conversions, with 78% of listeners approving of podcast ads. See, don't you guys approve of this ad already? It's so nice and pleasant because it's a host-read ad by me. Host-read ads are actually the most effective form of podcast advertising, and Zencastr works with podcasters to help create unique to them ad spots that create brand awareness and conversion. I can speak to this. I've been on the Zencastr Creator Network for a few months now, done a bunch of ads, and they have helped me through the process, answering all my questions and helping me make the ads whenever I need help. And they've connected us to some very cool advertisers who are right for our audience. So, interested in sponsoring this show or podcast ads for your business? Go to zen.ai/2biguys0. That's zen.ai/TWOBIGUIS, the number 0, and fill out the contact information so Zencastr can help you bring your business story to life. Hello, and welcome to 2Bi. I'm here today with a fellow bisexual podcaster. Ruby Susan Mountford is here with us today on 2Bi. Welcome, Ruby.
Hello, it's so nice to see you, Rob, to actually see you and to meet my fellow podcaster. What a delight. I think Indeed. Bisexual podcasting, you mentioned there's more of us now, but I think, and every time when they were starting to pop up over the last 5 years, I'd be like, hello friend.
Yeah. Well, you guys were one of the few that existed before we got started, and we got started kind of because there was something missing in the space, but you guys have actually been doing it not in the US but over in Australia for a long time.
That's right. We're down under. We're the bisexuals down under. I think we actually, because our podcast is actually a live radio show on Joy 94.9, which is the LGBTIQ plus community station in Australia. And it's one of only 3 24-hour LGBTIQ stations in the world. And it took them a while to get a bisexual show, but they did. And then we became one of the top performers in podcast downloads on our late night Tuesday radio slot.
Wow, very cool. It's different. Yeah, I don't know of anything that we have like that that's live radio. Anyway, by the way, Ruby Susan Mountford is an LGBTIQA plus and disability advocate and public speaker. They're radio and podcast hosts in Melbourne, Australia, as we've discussed. They're the co-host of the TripleBiPass podcast and vice president of the Melbourne Bisexual Network, among other bisexual and disability advocacy you've done before that we'll talk about. So welcome again, Ruby. Before we go too much further and talk about all that stuff, how do you identify? What pronouns do you use?
Thank you so much. I identify as bisexual. Shockingly, I'm a non-binary person. I'm also autistic. I use the term neurodivergent, but I do think it's important to say autistic as well. And I have ADHD, and I'm a nerd. Those are, I think, my big identity. Cool. I'm a Dungeons and Dragons player. It takes up a lot of my life. And I'm an advocate. I think those are the labels that I like. And I am disabled. I know, so I think often in language we'll talk about person with disability, but I prefer person first language. So I'm autistic and I'm disabled.
Cool. And so you've done a lot of advocacy work in both. I guess we'll get into how they might intersect, but actually let's start with your bi identity, but then I'm curious how it intersected with those others. How did you realize you were bi, and what was that development like early on?
Yeah, I think I was 15, 16, and I had a friend who identified as bisexual, and she made it clear she was quite keen. And I was just like, no, I'm a straight woman. As I was making out with my other with his friend, like, that's what gals being pals.
Yeah.
And so I kind of realized I was bisexual because of her. And then when we broke up, I was the only other queer person I'd known, like, who neither of them went to my school. She actually had gone from identifying as bisexual to identifying as lesbian, and she said that lesbians don't date bisexual women. And so I kind of stopped feeling like I could really go into the spaces like -18 that were a space for people who are under 18 to go to queer places. And also the scene was still pretty small insofar as, like, a lot of the gay bars, like, if you didn't know people, all you could really go to were like the two gay bars we had, which were very kind of more for men. And also, like, if you weren't kind of presenting very butch, people kind of wouldn't really read you as a queer, they just read you as a tourist. And so, but then also, I started dating another woman when I was in my early 20s, and then I saw a psychologist who told me that she thought I wasn't bisexual, I was just straight and really desperate for attention. And
Wow.
because I wasn't having strong feelings about the person I was dating at the time in a romantic way, I questioned myself a lot. And also because by that point, the doubts about, are you really bisexual, that had been such a common part of my experience, ever bringing it up, or even just having it as part of a bio on, like, a social media platform or something. Or if anyone remembers Vampire Freaks, the platform for the alternative crowd for a little while. But I believed her. And so it wasn't until I ended up falling in love with another friend who lives in the United States, and we met for the first time. And she told me first, and then I was staying at her house, and she just kind of leant forward and just kissed me and then ran away. And I was just like, okay, well, I'm not straight. Okay, I'm not straight. Okay. And it was honestly such a relief to know I hadn't just been performing, that I hadn't been the person I'd been kind of socialized to think that maybe I had been. I was doing it for attention. I was doing it for male attention. I was using queer women, which is how I've been made to feel a lot. So, but honestly, as far as bi identity and being proud of it, like, it wasn't something I really moved past. I accepted that I was bisexual. I didn't really see it as an important thing, though. I didn't want to, like, it wasn't until I started volunteering at Joy. I originally started doing front desk, and I moved on to being a newsreader, then I moved on to doing current affairs. And they knew I was bisexual because I was a little obnoxious about it, just in that point of saying also bisexual when they'd say, like, lesbian and gay. So they asked me if I wanted to be on the Bi show they were starting up. And it really wasn't until I'd started talking to other bisexual people that I recognized how much I hadn't, like, how much some of the things I thought I'd gone through alone were really common experiences, and how much we needed and wanted a space to talk about it, and how much joy. Like, our first few episodes of the podcast are rough, but we're very excited. Like, I'll say that we're very excited because, and then it gave me a reason to be curious about bisexual identity, which I don't think is something I would have had otherwise. Like, it's not something I would have gone and researched. I wouldn't have been looking at studies. I wouldn't have found out all this data about how mental health is actually worse than the gay and lesbian community. And this massive correlation with non-binary identity and bisexuality, and this massive correlation with neurodivergence and bisexuality. And that's one that's come out later, I think. But I was diagnosed as an autistic person and with ADHD when I was 25. So about a year after I'd started doing radio with Joy and, like, learning how to be proud of myself and my identity as a queer person, as a bisexual person. Still wasn't quite sure on the gender stuff, but I was starting to kind of meet enough people to recognize I could explore that and question that in myself. But finding a pathway to pride as a bisexual person is hard, and it takes because no one around you in mainstream queer spaces really gets why that's important, or even if they're bi themselves or pan or multigender attracted. And I think having to have made that journey as a bi person meant that when I made that journey as an autistic person, as a person with ADHD, I knew what to look for, and I knew how important it was going to be to find people and to meet people and to be able to share our experiences and to be able to share the positives. Do you know the Dorothy Riddle scale of internalized homophobia?
No.
Oh no, no. Riddle scale, officially hers is the Riddle scale of attitudes towards difference, and originally it was the attitudes towards homosexual people. So she put it this whole scale of the journey people go on to go from, being repulsed by homosexual behavior to nurturing it and to loving people. So the Riddle scale is how other people perceive us. So it goes from repulsion, pity, tolerance, and acceptance, and they're all negative emotions. And then the positive emotions are support, to admiration, to appreciation, and nurturance. Now, what this was important for me was the fact that she actually identified tolerance and acceptance as negative, because she was saying
I was going to say, yeah.
Because being tolerated and accepted still implies there's something to tolerate and accept.
Mm-hmm.
It still creates a difference and a power imbalance. And I think this was important because I realized that acceptance was about as much as I'd ever hoped for.
Yeah.
As a bi person. And then this led to when I had the opportunity to find it's from an Australian guide called Not Round Here. It's basically, sorry, I'm just checking. I want to make sure I, give the right reference for it, internalized phobia, because it really changed my life, and I want to make sure I get it all right. But basically, it was looking at the scale of internalized, how we handle these behaviors in ourselves and these feelings in ourselves, because we all carry internal. We're victimized by the societies we grow up in and the cultures we grow up in, and we're shaped by them. And so this was looking at the attitudes we had where we were dealing with internalized phobia, whether that's homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, rejection of intersex status, was denial, and then self-hatred, and then self-pity, and then resignation. So those are the negative feelings we have to move through to really start to have self-acceptance, and then self-love, and then supportiveness, when we can actually start to reach out to other people. And when we transcend those internalized phobias, we find pride and we find celebration. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, what I've learned in my space and my journey was that it wasn't until I could find pride and celebration in being bisexual specifically that I started to be able to unpack just how hard that had been and how low my standards had been for what I thought bisexual pride or bisexual acceptance was going to be. Because I think it's why I started to get very frustrated when we talk about bi visibility, or I'm like that I don't want to be visible. I want to be celebrated. Thank you so much. Yeah. Not to be a drama queen about that, but I would like to be celebrated, please. Thank you. And I guess I've also noticed that with a lot of other bi and pan people, often we don't see our bisexuality as the part of us that we want to be putting forward or talking about. Like, we're bi, and that's fine. Sometimes we even recognize biphobia, and that's cool. But the idea that actually being an identity we want to invest in and understand and unpack our feelings towards isn't something that we really see, because in the spaces we're in, including LGBTIQ spaces, again, we don't really get past acceptance. Tolerance and acceptance is often, I think, about as far as I get in those spaces. And it wasn't until I really recognized that and recognized that there was more than that I feel I actually kind of started to see what everything was about and get very obnoxious about how important this was to me. And that led to setting up a grassroots group, Melbourne Bisexual Network. It led to setting up a Facebook group and running, picnics and drink meetups to get people to meet each other. The first one, 2 people rocked up, and then it got better after that. But and that was 2018, I think those started. And that was just after Australia had we'd had the equality law change after a very, very traumatizing postal survey that was done to see how Australians felt about letting the gays get married, as the language was. And the campaigning with that really left behind anyone who wasn't gay and lesbian. The campaigning was about, because that was around, there's a lot of reasons for that. We had to win because the losing would have cost us a lot. That it was, it meant that the bi plus people, you had a lot of bi people who had maybe previously not really thought much about being queer because they were in, say, different gender relationships and it hadn't really been acknowledged as part of them. But then this happened and everyone was in a lot of pain. And because we had a campaign, we had yes and no campaigns. So I think similar to Proposition 8 in California, maybe, we had a public vote, a non-binding public vote on if we should be able to get married or not. And so you had a lot of bi people come out as very strong allies, but maybe not for themselves, but for gay and lesbian people and for trans people. And I think we've got a lot of internalized apathy that tends to build up when no one around you is really discussing your identity or including you in conversations or addressing what's wrong. And it's very hard. I know I just keep talking because I really can talk about this for a long time, and I do on the radio. But it is so hard to fight something when it's invisible.
Yeah.
It's so hard to recognize the impact it has on your life and the pain it causes you when no one acknowledges its existence. And I think it was really starting to find out just how much BIPOC people were suffering without knowing why, or even if we were, that I started to get I wanted to build more spaces for us to be able to have conversations and meet each other, because I'm not sure, but having a BIPOC community has changed my whole life. And I want that for everybody.
Okay, so I have a million questions about that. I want to talk about that community.
Yes,
but it also strikes me as, yes, that's this like erasure and invisibility that hurts you in a way that you don't even realize until you then look back on it sometimes.
Yeah.
And also it's what you just said about, the yes or no vote on marriage. Like, a lot of times, especially politically, our identity gets boiled down to a binary, which is literally antithetical to the identity. And so, of course,
we can't exist with that, right? Like, we can't.
Right. Of course, the nuances and the things that make this fluid identity special get erased in that kind of a binary. But also sometimes we need to, because we need to vote yes, and we need to have the rights. And so we kind of have to, unfortunately, squeeze ourselves to vote yes or whatever. Okay. Anyway.
Yeah, no, but we're expected to. Like, that's the other thing. Like, the idea that I would say I don't want to vote for this because it's left me behind would be seen as inherently selfish by my communities. No questions asked about that. And it would feel bad. Right. Like, it would, because like that's not a big deal. And I think that's how it's always feeling, right? You're always kind of taking away, or you're distracting, or you're bringing up, and not like, having to bring it up all the time. It always feels like you're annoying, or I'm annoying, or like I'm being obnoxious, or like I'm like, dividing the community, when I'm just like, I'm just pointing out, I just want to point out that maybe you haven't, or actually that's not, it's just starts, you start to be that annoying kid in the class being like, actually, excuse me, actually, like, again, I'm a nerd. Actually, if you look closely, you'll find that the majority of bisexual people are in different gender relationships, but that's still queer. Yeah,
it's very complicated, and that's what sort of makes it interesting and fascinating to me. But it's also what makes it can be hard to get through to people sometimes.
I think Shiri Eisner puts it so well in Notes Bisexual Revolution, because it's that sense of our I know, right? Like, our societies and our cultures, and like are very determined on gender separation, and a lot of the logic behind that falls flat at the idea of bisexual people. Like, the idea of separating genders so early because of the potential for romantic interest. Of course, it was also erasing homosexual interest and homosexual like romanticism, but it also like the attitude that men and women can't just be friends, and like there's always like, we could have no friends if we could have be friends with anyone with the potential to be attracted to. But the idea that gender is not the predominant attraction, like that can't exist in the way society separates people as we go. So I think we still debate these things, because bisexuality, multigender attraction cannot be allowed to exist for these structures to continue. And we internalize that so much, like we don't think we really exist. And I think there's a lot of crossovers that with being non-binary, with being autistic, and having invisible disability in general, is the constant doubting and the needing to constantly affirm yourself and to constantly remind people, actually, no, I'm here. Actually, no, I do exist. Actually, no, I am like that. You need a lot of internal reserves to do that. And for those reserves, you need community, as far as I'm concerned. You need people to be able to reflect back at you. Yes, you are real. Yes, you are real. Yes, your experiences are real. Not to this term gets used to the point of kind of being a joke, but like, yes, that your feelings are valid. Like, and I think it's so difficult to have to constantly reinstate yourself. Often when that reinstation, it doesn't come with an apology, it comes with an eye roll, because part of biphobia is being literally annoyed at the existence of bisexual people.
Yeah. You're right. I've experienced that.
Right? Yeah, it's a whole thing.
Totally. And you're like, I think one of the things that unites most of my podcast guests on this show is our love of Shiri Eisner and their work. Like so many people I talk to are like, that book was the thing that made me realize or connect my sexuality to my politics and my full identity. And you're right. It just makes me think of like how people look at bisexuality, and I looked at it at a certain time too, as this thing that's about breaking down a gender binary. But really, heteronormativity boxes us in so many other ways, because monogamy is related and our own gender identity is related. And what you talked about friendships being like different levels of relationships.
Relationship anarchy. Like, absolutely.
Yeah, it's not just like we have romantic here and friendship here and that's it, and they're binary. Like all of that is fluid, and that's sort of what her book
exactly.
talked.
And I mean, like, I think it was also, again, just having such a strong voice, being so adamant about bisexuality as identity, because, I was starting to get the pressure about, why don't you use pan? Bisexual means two, and all these things, like, where it was starting to kind of feel difficult. And I think Shiri's been able to really pinpoint why that's part of the problem. Like, why is bisexual never the word we're allowed to use? Why is anything but bi is kind of the go-to, even with kids. Like, generationally, I get excited by seeing a lot of bi plus people on TikTok, but I also kind of start to get a bit sad when I see that the same conversations about, like, I don't need labels. I'm like, everyone needs language. Everyone needs language to describe what you're going through and to find community. If we didn't need labels, we won't need labels when we don't have prejudice. And we're not there yet. So, I always think of, I've got this joke, which is, what's the difference between a unicorn and a bisexual?
What?
You'll see a unicorn on TV, not a horse that doesn't like labels.
I like it. Yeah. Actually call it what it is.
Yeah.
I had something to say, but now that distracted me.
I'm sorry.
The bisexual unicorn.
That's a whole other conversation. Unicorn hunting, my gosh. Running a Facebook community, having to be like, no, you can't come here to pick up. No, you can't come here to pick up. No, you can't come here to pick up for you and your boyfriend or for you and your girlfriend. Get fucked. Sorry, can I swear on your podcast?
Oh, of course.
Get fucked.
It seems like you still use the word bisexual.
Oh, yes.
Which I do too, and I like it for a lot of sort of historical reasons. I also identify as pansexual because the definition fits me. But obviously I'm with Shiri of like, this fight is kind of a distraction of our oppression. So like, what does bisexual mean to you sort of today?
Look, I agree. Like, I had the absolute pleasure of meeting Robin Oakes. She came to Melbourne to speak at a thing, and I was also speaking there, and I was starstruck. Then we had to run a workshop together, and I went back to being like, I'm very tired, overstimulated. We have to sort this out. But her definition of bisexuality, I think, and which I also learned from Shiri Eisner's book, which is, I call myself bisexual because I recognize in myself the potential to feel attraction to more than one gender and or sex, not necessarily in the same way, to the same extent, or at the same time. I don't use pansexual because often people say attraction without gender, and gender exists and gender is important for a lot of people. And I also, I guess I struggle a bit with this idea of like removing gender from how we interact with people, because like, gender impacts how we treat each other all the time. And so that's why I don't use that. I like the flag though. I think the flag's pretty nice. And I also I don't have yet. I think after running groups and stuff for years, I think it is a huge draw on our energy and our resources to try and constantly be having this. But then the issue is, of course, like, how do you explain then to people outside of our communities being like, they seem really similar. It's like, yep, they are, move on. Like, that's it. They are, move on. Like, you don't really understand how queer is different to gay, and that's fine, move on. Like, it's difficult, I think, because people want the boxes. And bi and pan and polysexual and omnisexual and all these terms that are coming up that are all multigender attraction, but different, they all tend to kind of, or they have broad overlaps, and that's also fine. Like, it's difficult because I use bi plus, and when I'm doing political and like, discussing, because it's like saying this is an umbrella term, and they all fit within this kind of big umbrella. Not everyone agrees with that either, but like, I guess like, for me, I still, and this is like, I think I still can sometimes feel a bit sad when someone's definition of pansexuality limits who I am because, you know, they'll often be, oh, it's not binary. I'm like, I'm a non-binary bisexual. So like, you know,
Right.
I do exist, I swear.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess like, but I also just see it as kind of like, I used to be like, before I understood properly and could unpack it more, I had less patience. And now it is just like, call yourself what you want, but show up when we need you, please.
Right.
And
Right.
I think that's become a big part of it too, like seeing who's going to do the work, you know, and like I'm not saying we should, but there's a lot of work to do, and like who will speak up. And often I find that you know, we've had some data come here that shows people who are both pan and bi are very unhappy at work to similar levels. And so how do we kind of address and make things that are comfortable for everybody there? And if people's labels change over time as well, which they ought to do, you know, I know that that's something people can feel really ashamed about if they've gone from like bi to pan or pan to bi or bi to omni, and how will communities feel? And we've got some Facebook groups and stuff that are really militant about it, you know, like and I keep an eye on them because I want to know what the discussions are so I can address them when they pop up, because, you know, I've noticed that we've got like a bi hive mind internationally, that when ideas pop up, they pop up in the same places, like, or different places around the same time. Of like, what happens after visibility? What do we do now? Like that conversation starts hopping up everywhere. So as we reach a point where we know that the discussion of what is bi versus pan, bi and pan, what does it mean? Why are people so angry about it? I think it's important to know why that's there and where the anger comes from, and why the choices are being made. And I suppose I'm lucky in that I'm willing to, and often will, tell you exactly what bisexual means to me, and exactly why I'm exactly what I say I am, and I'm not interested in being redefined, and why I think it's also wrong to say everyone should just use pan, which has come up a few times, because again, it's like, why is it everything but bi? But as I said, it's difficult. It's really difficult, because people want it to be easy, and it's not, because nothing about human sexuality is easy.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and also, and maybe this is a good segue because I have some more personal questions, but it's like, I was listening to one of your early episodes of TripleBiPass about like the history of bisexuality. And it's like the word bisexual has really only been used the way it's used earliest in like the 60s, and then more and more in the 80s and 90s with the rise of the AIDS and HIV crisis. But it's like people with multisexual attractions have existed forever. I mean, almost every recorded civilization, we see that. Even before humans, our close ancestors in the ape world are
most of the natural world, honestly.
Attraction. Yeah. So it's like, it's a thing that exists. It's just like, what has it been called and how has it been treated at different times and in the current context? And so in some ways, the rise of pan is like sort of interestingly correlated with a lot of rise in trans and non-binary identities, and then maybe like a misinterpretation of bisexuality that, you know, maybe it didn't, people think it wasn't inclusive of that, but
people weren't looking at the history, because no one looks at bisexual history, you know. And so these terms were being defined by people who weren't from the communities that were, you know, made them in the first place. I think that's also been a part of it. Like, you don't find a lot of bi history in, like, you know, general, like, you know, it's changing now, but like pride centers and LGBTIQ spaces. So you had a lot of people who weren't bisexual, who hadn't had a lot of interaction with bisexual communities, just telling people this is what bisexual means. This is what it means. And shockingly, like, I think a community should be able to self-determine. I think that's an interesting point, though, the rise of it at the same time, because like, and then but now we've got like, you know, polysexual came about because it was trying to say most genders, but not all, but like similar, many genders, and then omni is something else as well. And like, personally, I think more flags is better, because it means just like, you know, it's a lot of color.
Exactly.
But I also think, it's great that kids are like, it's great that I'll say kids, because it feels like a lot of this stuff started to unravel on Tumblr, like kind of unfurl. That's what I that's why I got radicalized anyway. But but it was just kind of watching the discussions and like, you know, the back and forths and like these experiment, like wanting to find language. And again, so whenever someone says, oh, do we need to have labels? I'm like, well, obviously we do, because people spend a lot of time trying to find the right one.
Yeah. So I'm curious about your non-binary identity. Like, when did you realize that, and was it in any way related to your exploration of bisexuality?
Wouldn't have happened without it. Impossible.
And then, and like, how'd you come out and when?
Oh gosh, I think like much like bisexuality, I come out all the time, every fucking day. Like, you know,
when did
yeah.
you come
When
out
did
to
I?
yourself,
So
and then the
that's the great
first
part.
start?
Yeah, and
When
the
did you
first
start coming
beginning.
out?
I think like I would not have. I think by having more access to bisexual literature and bisexual histories and philosophies and political arguments and manifestos, it, you know, there's that, you know, the bisexual manifesto from that magazine, Anything That Moves, in 1990, which is like, you know, does say don't assume anything about anyone's sexuality, including your own. Don't assume we're duogamous in nature. Don't assume that there are only two genders. Like all this stuff, when you start to sit down and really unpack what gender means to you in attraction, like, and actually unpack it, like, you know, because I used to be, before I had access, I was like, I would kind of be like, well, I want, you know, women who are women and men who are men, because like I didn't know anything else, but also like it was a kind of, it was a way of, what do you call it, acceptability politics, to try and be like, I'm not trying to disrupt anything. I just, you know, I just like boys and girls. Jokes on me, I like everybody. But but yeah, it was really about kind of unpacking what gender meant to me when I met people and in myself, and meeting other people who had gone on those journeys. And like, you know, until I was starting stuff with Joy, like a lot of BIPOC people, I did not have access to any kind of queer space. I didn't feel comfortable in queer spaces. I was nervous and I was very anxious about the idea of being in there and being an imposter and being told I didn't belong there. And so I think it was getting to meet other folks and starting to having the space to be like, all right, I actually want to think, am I a woman because I feel like one, or because that's the only option I've ever known? And so starting to be in places where I could be like, okay, I use she and they, like suddenly pronoun rounds were a thing. Everyone gets to say their pronouns. I'm like, okay, I use she and they pronouns. And then honestly, I think the first time I had a few friends and we were organized, and I'd met through a big queer conference. And one of them was like, what pronouns do you want to use? I've heard these being used, but I don't want to assume. And I was like, actually, I would really, really like they if you could use they them pronouns with me. And it was that sense of thing, like I feel safe to try it, and also knowing that I didn't have, you know, that I was trying it. And so I think they were the first people I kind of was like, I'm gonna do this. And that was, I think, middle of 2018 again. Like so it wasn't too long after I started being in big queer spaces that I was kind of like, oh, something's sticking here. And then as I kind of started to do more work and started to be like, no, not she, they, I'm just they. And then I started to find out about how many autistic people are non-binary, and how many autistic
interesting.
people, yes, autistic people are trans and non-binary, very, like I think between 30 and 50% of the communities. And that's particularly in people who were assigned female at birth. But it's not just, but like we see it a more percentage wise in that, you know, in that my cohort there. And a part of it is like, and people are saying, oh, is it autistic gender? Is that like, do we have our own gender? I'm like, well, I think if we look at gender being a cultural and societal, you know, grouping, we are less sensitive to those things and we question those things. And I still like, and so I think studying in the UK found that like 30% of the trans plus community interviewed were autistic. Here at the Royal Melbourne Gender Clinic for Children, we have about 30% meet the criteria for autism at least. And in like studies on groups, we find that like 70% of people who identify as non-binary or autistic or neurodivergent to some capacity. So it's a pretty high correlation.
Wow. Yeah, I had no idea.
Yeah.
Although it makes sense based on a lot of spaces I've been in and my bi group in New York and stuff.
Yeah. I think as well, like autistic people are more likely to identify as bisexual than lesbian or gay. And again, it's because gender isn't, a part of it is respectability stuff doesn't hit the same way. Like if I don't understand why something isn't right, it's hard for me to go along with it. Justice sensitivity. Yeah. And yeah, I think like but I only I started to do work, and I started to, like, what I'll say, and this is hard, it took me a long time to come out to my family, because I lived with my parents for a while, as a lot of autistic folks do, and a lot of people do in general. I'd been quite sick when I came back from living overseas for a while, and I struggled to find work for a while. And because I knew, because I was doing all this work outside of my home, where I was having to assert myself across multiple platforms. And because I'd already gone through that whole sense of, are you really bisexual with my parents? And like, aren't you going to pick a side eventually? I was like, I don't want to do that again. Like, I want to go through the same fucking arguments again. And it just felt like it was going to be history repeating, right? Like, and then to be fair, my dad did say, but just because you're bisexual doesn't mean you have to be non-binary. I'm like, I know, but in this case, it's not because I'm bisexual. I just am. And so that's only really happened, I think, when Christmas 2020, I let my cousins know, and they let their parents know. And then I told mom and dad, and I was like, I'm not going to correct you too much because I live with you and we'll all hate each other, but I'm going to start to expect better.
Wow.
And look, we're getting there. The mum corrects herself. The pronouns are difficult, and I work as an LGBTIQ officer, like in health organizations, so I'm there to point out all the ways I need to improve. So I have to, as part of my job, be like, I'm sorry, no, my pronouns are they, them. Sorry, no, that's not right. Which gives me some authority to do it without knowing it's going to risk my job, because it is my job. But it's still hard. Like, I don't love conflict. I'm not a huge fan. I love debating, but I don't like having to deal with people's annoyance about it, or like their confusion, or the, oh my God, I'm so sorry. Oh my God, maybe like, I just don't, this isn't my problem. Like, yeah. And I suppose as well, there's the whole, and this is again, the bi parallel and autistic parallel, like, am I trans enough? Am I non-binary enough to belong to that space, to claim that space? Am I disabled enough? Am I autistic enough? Am I queer enough? Am I queer enough to enter? But I think all the work I did with being bisexual and recognizing just how queer it was to say, actually, fuck gender entirely, in all the ways that term could mean, I think kind of has helped me a lot with feeling confident and resilient enough just to know when I will pick the fight and to know when I won't, to know to expect the change to take a long time, but also to recognize that at the end, when I did share it, it was because I wanted to nurture it first. And if sexuality is about how we interact with the world, gender is how we interact with ourselves. And I think it is for me. And so I didn't want to share it until I felt that it would be treated properly and that it was strong enough to live out there on its own. And that took a little while, bit of nurturing, bit of tender loving care before I was willing to share it with anyone else.
Yeah. Wow. Fascinating. I had a bunch of questions, but you answered a lot of them as you went along. But yeah, no, I know it, like, it is exhausting. My partner uses they, them, and now is starting to use she. And like, I sometimes could see it's just exhausting for them to be correcting people, and even more to like then be having to use emotional energy to like calm them down when they're over apologetics, or it was just like, okay, say it and move on. And I've seen how, like, with family or close friends, like, it does take people time. Yeah, it can be exhausting, but it's also so kind of important and fundamental, because it really is a paradigm shift of how you view the world. And it's so interesting. I didn't realize that, autism might make you help see the world in that lens of like, because gender is a construct, and it really does. The more I think about it, the more it doesn't make sense, but it was very ingrained in me. Like, it made sense to the old version of me. I really had to kind of break free of it. I don't know.
That's the thing. It's something to break free of. Like, I think that's such a nice way of putting it as well, right? Because it's not questioned. And so many things, like, that's heteronormativity. That's like normativity in general, is when we don't actually get to question things because there's no room to ask. And I think I know friends who, like, have gone through this thing of like, am I non-binary? And be like, no, I'm not. But they feel so much better just for having actually asked themselves the question and figured out what made them feel like they are, like, attached to the gender that they were assigned at birth, and why that's really important to them. And like, as opposed to just never getting the space or the support that you need to go on that little journey safely.
Totally. That's a really nice way to put it. And I think that's kind of what I did. Cause I'm talking to a lot of people on this podcast. I'm like, why do I care about my male identity? Like, what does it mean to me? And I've kind of, but actually there are like, I actually do feel comfortable in that
Yeah.
identity. And I've interrogated like why that is. And yes, I like to kind of queer gender and do gender queer things.
Break through the norms of it a bit. Yeah.
Right. But that feels like that's my place in it, is to be a man who will wear nail polish or whatever.
Who gets to expand what being a man is, right? Like gets to kind of push on that little like and say, actually, I think we can be much more, which I think is really beautiful.
Yeah, well, and what's beautiful about this whole community is like that there's everyone can find their sort of place in it, and it's all valuable because none of us are alone. There's many people in whatever boat you're in. And so the more like visibility of all these unique things, the better.
I love it so much. And I feel also like, you know, in a bi community, you can explore your gender and know you're not going to leave it. The community, I mean, you know, like I've got friends who are trans men and trans masc who couldn't stay in like, you know, the butch lesbian communities they were part of beforehand. And, you know, and for trans women who are part of the gay communities and can't really stay in those communities as women in the same way. And so I think there's that kind of, you know, I like to, at least when a bi plus community is at its best is when we are radically accepting. And I mean that insofar as identities and movement and like, you know, we have people in my Facebook group who'll be like, actually, I've realized I'm a lesbian, but can I stay? And everyone be like, yeah, of course. Why would you not? Why would we say no?
Right.
Like, no, of course you could stay. Like we all know what it's like to be excluded or to be accepted with conditions, you know, depending on the gender of the person you're dating or how much like, you know, stuff, you know, how much you talk about what you are. And I think when we're in a place where we feel safe when we know what it's like to actually know that all those things are suddenly okay. The idea that someone would feel like they had to leave is abhorrent to me, at least. I really hate it.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you a little about your communities and your advocacy work there, but I do just want to connect a couple things because I'm loving everything you're saying. And it's like, I remember earlier you said like at work, you were the person who used to kind of say, if someone said gay or straight, you would say and bi. Yeah. And you maybe had some awareness at that time. It's funny when you said that, I was thinking, I used to do that at work too. And I had no clue I was bi when I was doing it. I was just like, I just like didn't like that it wasn't included. And I knew there's an acronym LGBT. But then like when I did finally start to come out, it was really going to this group in New York City that opened me up to it and helped me accept it in myself because I was with like real people who normalized these thoughts that I thought were kind of crazy until then. But what I loved about what you're saying that I also found was that room was about so much more than attraction to multiple genders. Like I learned so much from just seeing the people in the room and hearing them talk about whatever is on their mind that week and seeing all the diversity of so many other things too, and not just what I thought I was there to talk about. So including gender identity, including disability, including like racism and how all those things are connected to their bi identity. And so the group really gave me so much joy. Like I was so nervous to go to the group. And then every time I would leave, I was so happy in this way I couldn't describe. And now I look back and see it's because like, you know, I didn't feel alone. And I had this expansive experience of like, oh, the world could be like this. It could be so many things instead of just these boxes we're taught.
Really well said.
What are the communities like in Melbourne?
Yeah, because I agree. I think there's that sense of like, as you know, I was saying before, you don't realize how tight your chest is until you're in a place where you can relax, you know? Like as a bi person, you can never really know how anyone around you is going to respond to you telling them, because we never assume someone's bisexual by default. It's always if they're gay or straight. And we know that there's a good, that both, whether they're gay or straight, they might have an issue with being bi. And I think being in a space where you actually know, no, you 100% can and are here. You can be here and you can talk about that and have no hesitation in what people are going to respond to. The joy of that release and that freedom and that kind of that exhale of just like, oh, I can relax. You know, everyone's like, why are bisexual people so anxious? All these results show that you're all very anxious. I'm like, because we're always on edge. Like, who else has got to come out, like, you know, about their sexuality on a date? Like, you know, it's kind of it's this whole process. But honestly, I think in Melbourne, we had Bi Alliance Victoria, which did a discussion group, but there wasn't really many online spaces. And I was inspired by Misty Farquhar, who's a bi advocate in Perth, because they set up this Facebook group called the Bi Plus Community of Perth. And I remember seeing that and being very kind of inspired. And so I was like, I'm going to do this. And so I set up one for Melbourne in 2018. And for the first like 6 months, it was just me posting and just me adding people and just like kind of trying to build this space, and then starting to try and have like little events, like, again, like had a picnic, 2 people rocked up, had it at a bar the next time, we had 20 people. I started to do that. I did that every month for about a year. And each time would get more and more people, and like different people, and people who'd come back and return. And I also like I like hosting in that sense of like, someone's here by themselves, come over here. This person's also by themselves. Maybe you can find something to talk about. Oh, you're here with some friends. Great. Do you mind if this person comes and sits with you and chats with you? And every single person who came was just like, everyone is so nice. Like, everyone is so nice. And I was just like, well, everyone's looking for the same thing, I think. Everyone, like, we also had to watch that sense of, and the more people that there were, the more people who would come, because it's safer. You know, you don't have to be the first. You haven't got to be as visible. You haven't got to be on the front line.
Right.
We had that happen with our Pride marches as well. Like, Bi Alliance Victoria had already organized, had always organized them for a while, and we'd had issues. Like, we got heckled. We had to bring marshals in one time, and I remember as the group got bigger and we could start putting the event in there, we went from like maybe 20 to 30 people at a march to 80. And the mood changed, because when you're going with 20 people, you're going because you're being defiant and you're protesting and you're saying, that's right, I'm fucking here. That's right, look at me. Remember we exist, thank you so much. And then when you have 80 people, you're celebrating each other. It's not about anyone else. And I think that's the shift I've seen when people know that there's a community, like when they see even just photos, even if they don't want to go to those events themselves or they can't, being able to be in groups and talk to people and see the visible signs of there being others makes people actually feel like they can celebrate themselves. And I'm going back to this a bit because I think it's so important. I think often when we talk about the problems of being bisexual, you know, the erasure, the biphobia, the sexualization, the defaulting to male attraction, that, you know, if you can't really be like, you know, that bi men are gay and that bi women are straight and that bi non-binary people don't exist. Oh yeah, maybe you've heard something about that. But to bi guys, maybe I can't imagine why it would come up. But I think like there's that kind of talking about what's positive is what will get people to actually start to come out, because you know, I've spoken at a few conferences, and it's that sense of I can talk about the statistics about mental health, about our suicide rates, about our drug use rates, you know, how overrepresented we are in bisexual women have some of the highest levels of sexual violence in the community, like in the world, in any group. And that's compounded by disability, by race, by trans or cisgender, like stuff, like everything's exacerbated and compounded. But if I just sat there and heard someone tell me of how awful it was to be bisexual, I'm not going to celebrate myself for that. I'm going to see that as a part of me that I have to just put up with, but is going to make my life shitty. And so I think it's important to know those things, but having people around you also reminds you why it's good. And all the things that are so beautiful about knowing that you're with people you're with because of that you want to be with them, not because of societal pressure, you know, that you're getting to explore and express things, and that you can talk about the people you're dating, and that you can talk about your life and, you know, and your anxieties, but also you can talk about how beautiful it is to kind of see your people. And I don't know, I've had so many people, particularly older folks, come out to me like privately. It's also just reminded me of how important being extremely visible is for an invisible community. And communities, I think, when we're publicly together, that's when we're at our most visible. And for each other, fuck everybody else. We're visible to each other. And I think that that really just changes the game. And I think what I would love to see moving forward is, you know, there is still like I've part of Melbourne Bisexual Network for a while. We've developed like, you know, training, and we've like looked at ways to do internal assessments. Like we did a project with Bi Alliance Victoria about like creating like a by5 audit tool to help organizations assess if they're being inclusive, multigender attraction, but there is no demand for it because no one understands why they need it, because no one says the word bipohbia unless they're a bisexual person or one of the literally 3 allies I have that have come out of the queer communities that I know of who didn't turn out to be bisexual later, which is often what happens.
Yeah.
And so like it's that sense of we have to understand our identities and celebrate them to be able to recognize when things are wrong and to create that demand by demanding it for ourselves. And I think we settle for a lot less than we deserve. And I think the more we get to spend time with each other and the more we get to see that, it'll be so much easier, because it is hard to stand up for yourself, but it is easier to stand up for your friends. You know, people are more likely to report a sexual assault if they think that person will hurt somebody else. And so I think the more we see being bisexual and being pansexual, being polysexual, being like omnisexual, being multigender attracted, the more we see speaking out when these things are left out as important for everybody, and as a detriment to the people who might feel like they can't say those things because they'll lose their communities, which we know happens as well. We know that, people like are terrified they might be, they might lose their queer or their lesbian or their gay families if they come out as bi. I think the more that we can recognize and visibly celebrate who we are, the more people will actually be willing to come out and step up and want to be part of this and see why we're so worth the work.
Yeah. Yep. Totally. That's beautiful. And also I think these like bi community spaces, at least for me, were like for some time it was the first and only place I could be my complete authentic self. And that taught me both like how to do that, how to open up and do that. And it also taught me how great it felt and how good it could feel all the time if I was not censoring myself and repressing things all the time.
Oh my gosh.
And that's
yes.
Step one to being able to celebrate yourself.
And the same thing happened to me with autistic spaces. Like, bisexuality, I could start to go in there. And it wasn't until I was doing an autistic leadership program that another autistic bisexual advocate was like, you should apply for this. And suddenly I was in a space where I apologize for myself a lot. A lot of autistic people and people with ADHD, we hear, I think, like something like 200,000 more negative words when we're younger. Like we get a lot of negative feedback as kids about our behaviors. They tend to make we've got like issues of self-esteem, but you can't have self-esteem without having a sense of self. That's a whole other thing, But it wasn't until I was in a space where suddenly people were saying, don't apologize, we totally get it, it's fine. You want to sit at the back of the room and sort out cards while someone's talking? Yeah, that's fine, we get it. Like everyone understood not necessarily why somebody was doing a particular thing, but that they weren't, that the intention was fine. Like suddenly everybody, you didn't have to say, I'm not being lazy, I'm not being distracted. Like it was just accepted that you were doing what you needed to do and that you knew what was best for you. And then coming out of that space and kind of unmasking and learning how to unmask more and more, and how much effort I'd put into performing and being acceptable and tolerable and digestible. And I still have to do that to get a job because, like I work in mainstream health organizations. So there's a level of professionalism that is required that is difficult and takes effort. But I've learnt it mostly. Like, I'm still obviously I'm a chaotic gremlin and I will never change that entirely. But it's still there. But I think the spaces where you're with people who let you have room to explore safely and safely without negative consequence and without judgment, or but with gentle questions, like, oh, so what does work for you? The first time someone says, what pronouns do you want to use? And doesn't just assume, suddenly your brain can start sparking. And it's like opening a gate, right? Like if there's only been one path you can see, and then suddenly someone's like, what do you want to go? Do you want to go this way? And they're like, I didn't even know there was a path.
Right.
There's a whole path there.
Yeah.
It hasn't been lit up though. It's like, okay, well, do you want a light? Like, I'll walk down a bit and I'll hold the light up if you want to come down this way. And it's, I've had those conversations with people who and people have done them to me, and you pass it along. Like if someone is just kind of like, oh, I'm not a lady. I'm like, oh, well, do you use different pronouns? And be like, what do you mean? Oh, do you want to use like, are you non-binary? Let me like, can we talk about that later? And be like, what does non-binary mean? And then be like, okay, cool. Then, 3 years later, they've had their top surgery and they're like living their best life. And it's just kind of all, and all it takes is just someone being like, well, you don't have to do that if it's uncomfortable.
Right.
What makes you happy?
Right. When our identities are that gateway to a conversation. That's what it should be.
Yeah.
So you mentioned like the health disparities among the bi population and a lot of sort of crossover with disability community. Is that what kind of led you to some of the work you're doing, and or how did you get into the work you're doing? Can you tell us about it and the autism advocacy work and all that?
Yeah. Like I think the bisexual stuff came first, but then because I met another autistic person as part of that, and they knew I was autistic, and so they would start to also people would know I was an advocate who happened to also be autistic. And so I got asked to speak on a disability panel. And then this person also encouraged me to apply for this Autism Spectrum Australia, or ASPECT, set up their LGBTIQ Advisory Council, and they encouraged me to apply for that. There are a lot of autistic advocates. We're passionate people. We have strong feelings around justice, and we're often queer. And so in a lot of queer spaces, you get a lot of us. And so suddenly I was in places where I was hearing people talk about that and learning about it more myself. Like I was learning about the social model of disability. I was learning as I was expected to speak on it, which was very scary, honestly. And it was a part of me that I was only, when I was first diagnosed as autistic, I was horrified and really ashamed. This was in 2015. I didn't know anybody who was autistic. And so I knew I was autistic by the time I started working with Joy, but I wasn't going to talk about it because I knew that if I was just starting to unpack what it meant, but I also knew most people had no idea. Like the word neurodiverse was not a thing. And this is again, like only 5-6 years ago. It's changed a lot. But at the time, it was something that I knew was going to have a very big impact on how people would interact with me, even as I was trying to unpack how it meant how I interact with myself. And then, so it was only just very gently starting to see more autistic people in these queer and advocacy spaces, and these, talking about trans issues and gendered issues, disability, and have someone who it was safe to talk about how I felt and to kind of make noises and stim and flap. And recognizing that was okay. And then suddenly that person was encouraging me to do other stuff. And then I was meeting other people through there. And I was finding when I was talking about my experiences, a lot of people were responding and feeling like that made sense for them. And as you know, you'd have seen in the last 5 years, the explosion around neurodiversity and neurodivergent people. It's so beautiful. I get a lot of feelings because I've had most of my close friends in the last 5 years have been diagnosed with ADHD or autism or both, because we flock together like a bunch of emotionally deregulated wolves. We end up kind of being attracted to each other and finding and being friends with each other even before we fully understand all the bits of it, because we're hypersensitive, very emotive, all these kinds of things that mean we tend to get on well together. And so I know I act more autistic now than I used to because I've stopped hiding it so much. But it was through queer spaces that I could find my communities there and start to talk about it. But also, again, just because every time I talk about bisexuality, someone is hearing it for the first time. Every single fucking time, which can get old, honestly, because, after 5.5, 6 years, you start to just be like, is no one, how is this still new to so many people? And the same thing, I think, with and it's been interesting to see the difference with that, with neurodiversity versus bisexuality as well. But now I've got friends who, when they get diagnosed, have been seeking it out, and they know a lot of other autistic people, and they are fucking delighted. And I think about me just not telling my parents for months because I knew I was going to have to coming out as bisexual, after I'd have to come out, because you have to come out as autistic, because no one can tell. It's not it's not a visible thing. Other autistic people can maybe tell with each other. We can start to be I remember the first time a woman was like, are you autistic? I'm like, yes. You could tell? Oh my gosh. Because, what if I'm not really autistic? What if I'm just really shit? That. Yeah. What if I'm not bisexual? What if I just really want attention? What if I'm not trans? What if I just really want attention? What if I'm not, all these things. And
have to run through it.
Every single one. And all three involve coming out a lot because, but I think the work I was doing was also recognizing that there are more and more autistic people who people are getting diagnosed and finding out that, often they know they're queer, then they get diagnosed as autistic, and they need to find space for that. Or I also, some of the work I've been doing in the last few years has involved looking into like basically the human rights of people who live in residential homes, people with intellectual disabilities, to actually express sexuality and gender and to have the safety and the opportunity to do that. And not have the gatekeepers around them, like whether that's their families or the support workers, like enforce or like cut that person off from being able to express themselves and explore their own sexuality and their own gender, and which is what happens a lot of the time. And I think particularly with disability, I was involved in a project with Deakin that was called More Than Ticking a Box, which was a qualitative look at the lives of LGBTIQ plus people with disabilities, and everyone talked about needing to choose which part of them will be supported at any one time, because queer spaces are still not very friendly for disability, and disability spaces are still not very friendly for people who are sexually diverse and gender diverse and have intersex variations. And so basically trying to find that melting pot. I feel like being bisexual kind of prepared me to be like, constantly jumping between worlds in that way. And so that's why, I work as a disability inclusion officer for an LGBTIQ org, and I work as an LGBTIQ organizer for a mainstream org, and I work in disability spaces to get them better with queer stuff, and I work in queer spaces to get them better with disability. And I think the intersections there are getting more and more pronounced. But the work is off. The work just came back from, that was how for a lot of people we'd meet more new people like us, was through advocacy. It became like a social. It became like how you, because there aren't very many social support groups that I know of that aren't run by peers who also get burnt out all the time. So often it was through doing co-design or right, because you build it and the demand is so big that you just get swamped by it. And
that's where we are now.
Yeah, no, I feel that. I feel it very, very hard. We had that with Melbourne Bisexual Network. With Melbourne Bisexual Network, we actually had to slow right down for a few years, not just because of the 242 days of lockdown, just because we're just there's a lot of demand, but we'll burn out if we keep trying to do everything.
Right.
So what are we going to do?
Right.
And we're all anxious. We all struggle a little bit with teamwork, like a lot of queer people do, because we started to learn we couldn't trust other people from the age of 6. When you start to recognize you're a bit different and you don't really recognize why, but suddenly unconditional love doesn't really mean the same thing anymore. Like all these things that, really impact our abilities to hold these groups together and be there for the people while also trying to look after ourselves and make any money to live.
You're explaining to me why our by request leadership meetings are like 2 hours long and they should be 10 minutes.
And it's also we got governance training and stuff, and that's helpful. But because but a lot of us you need folks with admin skills, and a lot of us don't have those. So so there's a whole lot of, and we don't get enough. And again, there's no money. I know that sounds very pro-capitalist of me, but if we look at the international funding for LGBTIQ people by groups, bisexual groups get nothing.
Our group gets nothing.
It's really difficult. And I think the assumption is that we're covered by the gay or straight initiatives. And it's very frustrating because it doesn't work out that way. It doesn't work. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I suppose the issue is there, again, going back to celebration, if the more that there is a bisexual community, the more that there are people who are bisexual in a lot of other spaces saying, well, actually, we need these things for our community, and seeing and talking. And when they say that, meaning bi people and not meaning everything, the understanding that we have specific requirements that are not met by the same thing, that even lumping in our data with the gay and lesbian communities distorts the data to the point where it's not really usable for us anymore.
Yeah.
And I think it's finding ways to, again, how do we have to have such a huge cultural change for that to be a big thing, though, because you have to, for multigender attraction to kind of be a significantly treated thing. I mean, what is it? Something only 52% of Gen Z or Gen Z is purely heterosexual. So we've got a lot of but again, a lot of them might not necessarily call themselves bisexual or see multigender attraction as a significant thing, as to why it's significant. Because again, when gender doesn't matter to you, it's easy to think it doesn't matter to anybody. And I think that's a human thing, right? We tend to assume until really proven otherwise that our experiences are universal, especially if we're white, and especially if we've had our stories be the main stories. But I think like it's very difficult to kind of recognize without it basically spending us. You need to find people who are willing to spend a lot of time talking to people about why it's important. And like I've seen breakthroughs, like I've made breakthroughs with people. It's taken a long time of just being like, yeah, okay. But also because they've had to be willing to listen and willing to question themselves. And a lot of gay people and straight people hate to question themselves. But I think like that's kind of why a part of me is like, the best thing we can do is put our energy inwards and also see how to do that strategically, which is also very difficult, right? Because like at what point, what is the aim? What is the goal? What are we trying to get people to do with themselves? Like with Bi Health Month, what are we trying to do? Raise awareness? Like, but with what? Like the impact on our health is biphobia. People don't understand what biphobia is and don't take it seriously. So do we start there? Do we start with getting other bi plus people to recognize and talk about biphobia and raise that and kind of like try and get campaigns going around that so people can actually see that if a phobia is so normalized that no one will acknowledge it's real, that's actually really serious. Maybe we should talk about that more. And I think, we see those breakthroughs in little bits and pieces. It's just a matter of how far we have to push that and how much help we have along the way. And if it's not a lot of help, how are we doing it in a way that keeps ourselves sustainable and protects ourselves? Because when burnout is real. I know I've gone through it. I'm sure a lot of bi people do because it's exhausting and it can be hard to see the difference. But, I see a lot more bi flags on TikTok than I used to. So I'll say we're doing something right.
Yeah, that is really interesting, connecting bi health to like biphobia and bi erasure, because so much does come from that. And I also have a million other thoughts about everything you just said, and I could ask you questions about all this for hours and hours. Maybe you'll come back next season.
Yeah.
But I do the one thing that is sticking in my head that I'll comment on for now, and we'll leave this open-ended, is I thought it's very interesting what you said about finding an autistic community sort of without totally realizing it. Because I had this, I mean, you talked about multiple parallels of these experiences, but like that feels like my bi identity is this thing inside me that I didn't recognize, but was affecting me on a daily basis. And looking back after I came out, it's been funny to see how many close friends, like close guy friends, or also women I dated who have now come out as bi or trans or non-binary. And it's like, oh, we're connecting on some level that we didn't even know about yet.
Yeah.
So that's
You're
really
all
interesting.
like going through some existential struggle.
Right.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, from a bi podcaster to another, what has the experience of hosting a podcast about this stuff been like over time? How has it affected you? And like, do you have any favorite guests or topics you've covered that really like changed your thinking?
I mean, so many. Like, okay, so honestly, the podcast was why I started to care about what bisexual meant. So to say it changed, like it had a huge impact on how much information I had just had access to and had a reason to look at. And again, my autistic brain kicked into overdrive. So suddenly I was memorizing all these statistics so I could start bringing them up in conversations and saying, well, actually, did you know that like 60% of bisexual women have been diagnosed with a lifetime mental health disorder in Australia? Like that kind of stuff, and so I think the experience of the podcast, it firstly also meant that as I was going into the queer scene for the first time, if I liked someone, I could be like, you're really interesting, come on my show. It was such a great segue for like being
It's
like,
my favorite
let's have I know, right? It's just being like, okay, we can sit in a room and talk about things that we both care about. This is the dream. And it gave me a lot of confidence to move forward and do that. It also meant I could find out about these really cool research that was happening or shows that were happening. And as far as favorite interviews, I really enjoyed interviewing. I think their name is Rosie. They're an academic from England, and they'd done this whole research piece on basically presentation of multigender attracted people and how the kind of clothes that we'll choose to wear and the trends in those for bisexual people was so interesting. That like bisexual men do want to dress like with more like typically feminine things. Bisexual women tend to dress more typically masculine. Like it was just so interesting to me, like all these kinds of gender mixing. So I think there was always that. Other things was that we had a lot of people come out through being on the show and were very nervous, but also really excited and happy. So that's been really, really cool. And seeing them as we all were talking about these things, and then just like their faces just kind of lighting up and just like afterwards being like, I've got a few questions. Like it was always just so lovely. I think as well, it's always been really lovely to bring in people to help me co-host, because like the co-hosts have changed a lot. It started off with I think like Catherine and Anthony, then became Anthony and James and me, and then it became Amelia, and then and there was just me for a little while, and then it was like Amelia and my friend Lou was helping me do editing and jumping on when they could, and then Amelia was there for a while, and then Amelia and Alex, and just seeing everyone like who gets on the show, see them start to realize like when you're doing a show every week about bisexuality, it becomes a very strong part of your sense of self. So I think that's always been the biggest gift for me, is like having such a strong sense of bi identity. That means I can go out there and just put it out in the world, because I know it's strong enough to cop people being like, are you sure? Yeah, I'm fucking sure. I do a show about it. Or if some guy's like, oh, you're bi, that's hot. I'm like, thanks. I do a radio show about it. Like, just being able to be like, don't question me. I know what I'm talking about.
Yep.
And also like, again, hearing the studies that were coming out, like the research, I think when I was talking to Julia Taylor, who did the Who I Am survey in Australia, which was the biggest survey of just bisexual people to look at why our mental health was so terrible, because it kind of, again, it gave me a lot to unpack around. It was when I first started to look into bisexual mental health and see that the social narrative that we had it easier didn't stack up to the facts. And I think that was a really important turning point for me, because it meant it was something to invest in, because bisexual people didn't just need we didn't just need voices and representation, we needed help. We need help. And I think that was a really important turning point for me, because it also meant that when someone's like, oh yeah, bisexual, easy way out, or straight privilege, being like, go fuck yourself, depending on where I'm at, is how I address that one. But yeah, I think that was probably the biggest transformation for me, insofar as suddenly, just being a lot more aware of what the stakes actually were. And as far as fun ones, it was really cool to talk to Mara Wilson. That was pretty rad, about being bisexual. And she also had never heard that bisexual people had worse mental health.
Wait, who is it?
Mara Wilson?
Should I know who that is?
She played Matilda.
Oh, cool. Oh, I remember that movie.
She's also been more recently, she's appeared on a video screen in Drag Race.
Cool.
Yeah, and she's a writer now, and it was really cool to chat with her. It was also it's always just really fascinating to talk. I talked recently about someone about Australia had their first season of the Bachelorette, and I talked with Patrick Lenton, who's a great writer, about reality television and being able to handle bisexuality, and a lot of our concerns came to pass, and like that sense of no matter what gender she chooses, someone if she chooses to be with a guy, all the queers are going to say she was like queer baiting, and that's exactly what happened. And I was just kind of like, yes, who could have predicted this? And I think just honestly, it's been 5 years, mate. I struggle to re-listen to myself now that I haven't got to edit my own stuff, because I talk a lot, and sometimes I'm reminded of that and I want to sink into a hole and die. But honestly, I think some of my favorite episodes have been ones where we've talked about exploring gender and sexuality through things like Dungeons and Dragons. Where it's also been when we've talked about new research, or when I've been able to or when I've brought someone on the show because through social media there's someone who's had a very strong reaction, and I've been able to give them a place to talk about it. Like we had, there was that recent scientific research where this guy who'd done a study about bisexual men not being real was suddenly like, oh, bisexual men are real, I guess. And I got to talk to someone who had a background in biology, and they could explain exactly why the testing methods were so flawed, exactly why the whole premise was flawed, in language that could directly counteract the language of the research, which was really nice, because I'm not an academic. I don't have the same vocabulary. And so it's been really great to be able to platform people to when they can demolish arguments. And again, I think the other big perk has been bringing on people who are pretty new to being out and giving them a very warm welcome and some really and being able to talk about why the things they're creating mean so much. This is particularly true. Like we had a young actor, Sam Anderson, come on, and he'd done a show called Bicycle about being and the whole thing, he's a fitness instructor who's gone through basically like a bisexual awakening and is panicking about it a lot. And when he started to come onto the show for the first time, like, you know, he was very new to being in queer spaces, and it was just really lovely to talk to him about how much his show had meant to a lot of my bi guy friends, and just how a lot of the issues he was talking about were actually issues that a lot of bi-plus people have faced, you know, whether it's eating disorders or being dismissed by a psychologist as attention seeking. Like, literally when I saw that one, I was just like, oh my God, yes. And just, again, that kind of being able to be part of the landing, of coming into a new part of yourself, I think has been a real big honor. Is that a weird way to say it? I don't know. It's people emailing and saying the show's helped them come out.
Yeah.
And that it's given them a sense of who they are. It's like it's really incredible. Like, sometimes when I've got on bi groups on Facebook, and like, oh, if anyone, like, I'm terrible at self-promotion. Like, I'm really bad at it. Really, really bad. And to the point where, like, it's really, like, had an impact, I think, on, like, my sense of what I could do with this stuff. But going onto a Facebook group and being like, oh, I do this show. Someone's like, oh, I listen to this. I'm like, you what?
Yeah. Yeah.
You actually listen to this?
Yep.
Oh, I find like I still struggle because people will kind of, it feels like it's such a, whenever someone talks to me who's listened to the show, I'm always so anxious about living up to what they need, because people listen to that show for a reason. Like, it's a very specific, we cover a lot of different topics, but you listen to it because you want to be immersed in bisexual stuff. And that usually happens when you're needing affirmation, or you want to kind of celebrate this part of you, or because it's new, or because you don't have access to communities in other places. So I think there's always that kind of sense of wanting to make sure I don't, when, you know, like, there's a lot more now, but when you start off and there's only a few podcasts out there, you know, you don't want to mess it up. You don't want to kind of say something that might make some people feel like really unhappy, or like, oh, they're not included.
With great power comes great responsibility. Yeah, we were
power
very
would be
nervous.
Nice. Yeah. I'd love more power.
True. We were so nervous at the beginning about, you know, saying something that someone wouldn't be happy with or would take the wrong way. But, you know, we've just tried to speak to our own experience as much as we can, and that's the best you can do. It's interesting. I think we've been on really parallel journeys in separate continents, because I identify with literally everything you just listed there, from the cool guests I've got to talk to the, like, people writing in and thanking us for doing stuff, and just the curiosity it's given me when I am looking at something online about this, of, you know, wanting to dig into it. And also, which I almost kind of realized as you were talking about it, but is like, it's given me a really solid bi identity that I feel confident in. And, you know, hopefully that would have happened without doing the podcast, but it certainly, you know, has done that for me, because it's like I feel like a little bit of imposter syndrome sometimes, and I faked it till I made it, but it feels real now. Like, it's, I really feel that solidity now.
5 years later, and like 200 podcast episodes, I feel like I'm actually bisexual.
Right. I am solid in my fluidity, in my everlasting fluidity is completely solid.
And also, I think we also both know from doing this just how big a gift that is, because it's still not very common.
Yeah. Well, and I, you know, it benefits me too, as much as, like, we're sharing this with other people. Like, it's really been a nice special thing for me, and getting through this pandemic.
Still there, but, you know, it's cracking away.
Yeah. So will you guys be back doing the podcast, or do you think you're moving on to other types of things in the future?
I miss it. I really miss it. And I guess a part of me has to weigh up how much the podcast has given me, but also the fact that there's a lot more out there now than there was 5 years ago.
Yeah.
But also if I can find more co-hosts, because, like, I can't, the days of me having the energy to do that show by myself, which was only a little while, but, like, it was enough that I, you know, like, I'm not in my 20s anymore. Like, I'm tired. And so I think if I can, but I know that they're eager to have it back, and I think it's important for it to be it's important for there to be a bi show on the station. It's just a matter of, like, if that means me trying to find a new team that I can build up around stuff, or, like, even just helping people find the station themselves and making their own thing. Yeah. I think bisexual community stuff I'm still going to be in for the rest of my life, because it's why I have a life in a lot of ways. And also because disability is a different level. Disability advocacy often can be a lot of staring into the void, and especially during pandemics where suddenly the value of life is very much apparent.
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually going to be in the US in May in Los Angeles, speaking about
cool.
disability inclusion and global LGBTIQ advocacy as part of the International Gay and Lesbian Association's conference.
Cool.
Yeah. And
I live in Los Angeles, so maybe I'll see you there.
Yes, I have no idea where to go and I'm scared. But yeah, I'm excited. I think though, the podcast, I would love to be able to start like having some more intergenerational conversations on there. Because like, I mean, there was a bit with me and Anthony. Anthony's like, I think about 15 years older than me. But I would love to be able to have like, more discussions. And we did a little brief series about, we had like one episode a month was about like a coming out story. Like somebody would talk about like their whole journey. And I think that those stories are still like, really, really important to hear.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, but I guess like I'm trying to figure out the best way I can put my energy into helping people build a sense of identity and celebration and communal responsibility with that. Because I really believe in communal responsibility in all things. I'm a big old socialist. But
another common theme of guests on this show.
Yeah, shockingly, when you start to break down like recognizing people as people, when you start to kind of like there's a reason it all links, when you start to break,
totally.
when you have to really rip apart societal structures to be able to exist and to know you can exist. Suddenly you just recognize that they're all built on sand anyway,
Yep. We could do another hour on that alone.
I know. But we can't. It's done. Point is, I know. I think if people want it to come back, I'll try and bring it back. I just also am aware that, my time has changed and priorities haven't shifted for me, but we're still in lockdown, kind of here, not in lockdown, but things are still weird. Everyone in Melbourne is pretty traumatized. Like, 241 days, like locked in your house will really mess with your brains.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I'm usually pretty weird, but I've gotten weirder. So like, I think, we'll just have to see how long it takes everyone to recover over here. I think it's going to be part of it. Cause I think we're going to hit some big old mental health, jumps in the journey ahead.
Totally. Yeah. That's intense.
Did you listen to our episodes where you had like Alex, Amelia and I just being like, hi, we're here. Still in lockdown.
I listened to a few during the lockdown and I understood the sentiment.
Yeah. That's why I was like, I remember saying we can be honest about this, folks. Like, I listen to a lot of podcasts. Like, it's nice when you recognize that everyone's going through the same thing. And also, if we try to pretend that we're not suffering, we're just going to sound very fake.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, cool. Well, Thank you so much for being here today, Ruby. And I look forward to seeing whatever it is you do next, whether it's going back to the podcast or whatever else is happening, because I don't know where this is going to lead me either. But I, like you, am passionate about these issues and advocacy. And congrats on building the Melbourne Bisexual Network. That I didn't realize how new that was. So that's awesome that you're doing that. And hopefully we'll see more of these things cropping up everywhere.
We did. There's now one in Sydney and in Brisbane.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
You can follow Ruby on Twitter at RubySusan29 and TripleBiPass at TripleBiPass. And you can go listen to the back episodes of that.
Yeah, we're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Podbean. We're not very active on Twitter, and my Twitter is maybe not as like. So I'm just saying, like, I don't post a whole lot there because I did one tweet that went viral because Miles, the bisexual message, shared it, but it's been that's been about it for the last year. But please follow me and like say hi. I shouldn't be saying that. See, I'm terrible at marketing.
Don't follow me, but do follow me and say hi. Yeah.
TripleBiPass is also on Instagram and Facebook.
Oh, okay, cool. Follow them on Instagram and Facebook. Follow everybody. Have a conversation, and yeah, thank you again for being here. This is a wide-ranging conversation, and hopefully we'll do it again sometime.
I don't believe in boxes anywhere, including conversations. It's been an absolute pleasure, Rob. It
was so nice to start this conversation with you.
Thanks for letting me run off.
Picking up. Thank you. No, thank you so much for doing it and for being here. This was really great.
Yeah, I'm gonna go. It was a pleasure, and maybe I'll see you in Los Angeles.
Two Bi Guys is edited and produced by me, Rob Cohen, and it was created by me and Alex Boyd. Our music is by Ross Mincer, our logo art is by Caitlin Weinman, and we are supported by the Gotham, formerly IFP. Thanks for listening to Two Bi Guys.